Well, hi guys. I wanted to make a video about a Bible study that I recently had with two Mormon missionaries that came to my door. Whenever I get missionaries coming to the door, I let them know up front, hey, I am a full-time preacher for the Church of Christ. I've been reading the scriptures since I was 9 years old, and I would love to visit with you guys. And that's how I started. And if they're willing to, have a discussion, that's great. Sometimes I'll have to schedule it for a different day and maybe meet at a yogurt shop or something similar to that, kind of a neutral place. Well, sometimes if you've ever had Bible study with missionaries or door knockers, unfortunately, the whole thing can get contentious pretty easy. They're going to say, you're wrong because this is what I believe and I'm wrong, or vice versa. And it can just feel like it doesn't go anywhere. But this particular Bible study went really, really well, I feel, for both parties. And I wanted to share with you what the nature of the study was, because you may want to incorporate some of the same methods. So what I shared with the missionary boys is that I've been reading the Bible since I was 9. I believe wholeheartedly that the Bible is a divine, supernatural book. There's no other book like it. The wisdom of the Bible, the nature of the Bible as a complete package is something that's got God's thumbprint on it. When you look at the Bible and certain information about the Bible, you can't help but realize that it was a divine, transcendent, wise knowledge that came from a creator and not from the creation. And so I share with the missionaries, I'm convinced of that, and I would like to share with you for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, why I believe the Bible is divine and transcendent. And they're very receptive to that because they embrace the Bible as well, and most of them probably don't know the history about the Bible. In return, I say, and then if you'll let me do that for 10 or 15 minutes, then I would be happy to listen to you because I'm not familiar with the Book of Mormon that you are. So I'd let you do the same thing. You let the Mormon missionary present to me why they think the Book of Mormon is transcendent, divine. What do they see that makes them believe that God's thumbprint is on this book and it was impossible for it to be written any other way? So it worked out really great. So I'd like to go over you the 5 questions that I told them information about the Bible, and then those same 5 questions I let them have the opportunity. So question number 1, but item number 1 that I shared with them, and these are all answers that you can just Google and find right off of your smartphone. So the first question is, who wrote the Bible? And the answer is there was about 40 authors that wrote the different books of the Bible as a whole. Second question is, how long did it take to write the Bible? What was the span of time that these 40 authors wrote? And it's about 1,500 years. If we go from Moses all the way to John writing the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, that whole period of time spans about 1,500 years. So that in and of itself is a conversation starter. That's pretty fascinating. And for the Bible to have one seamless gospel theme that started out in Genesis and finished in Revelation, for there to be a seamless theme in a book that took 1,500 years to write, a couple different languages, 40 different people, that's a conversation to be had. That's something to reflect on. So that was interesting. We're both enjoying the study so far. The next question was, what language was the New Testament written in? The New Testament was written in Greek. The Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew and some Aramaic. So that's interesting. Those are languages that if we look up are familiar and historical, so on and so forth. The next question, question number 4, is where we start getting more into the transcendent nature of the Bible. Question number 4 is those original manuscripts, let's just say for the New Testament, the ones written in Greek, how many copies do we have today in that Greek language? How many copies do we have available to us so that we can check and cross-check our English translations? And the answer to that is about 5,800 copies of Greek manuscripts survive today. And that's an easy Google search. How many Greek manuscripts of the New Testament are there? 5,800. That is also an amazing number. And there could be a big conversation around that, because when you look at other Greek manuscripts of antiquities, there is no other book of antiquities, no Roman historian, Plato, Homer, none of the extant written Greek manuscripts from antiquities have that many copies that can be checked against each other. I want to say probably Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, that there's probably the Iliad has the best attestation, and that only has, I believe, like some 600 Greek manuscripts that survive. So 600 compared to 5,800, that's where I start using this language of transcendent, unreal, unmatched by any man-made book in antiquities. If we look at beyond the original language, which was the Greek, if we look at all of the languages that those early documents of antiquities were translated into, I don't even know what all the languages are, but Latin, Hebrew, it's not really that important. But there are 20,000 manuscripts in all languages that we have of the New Testament. 20,000 manuscripts. Again, there's nothing like that. They say that there is nothing as well attested in all of antiquities. No book as well attested by surviving manuscripts as the Bible. So there's a lot of conversation that could be had in those numbers there. Let me go on to question number 5. One thing you want to ask is, what's the earliest surviving manuscript? This is just kind of fun for curiosity. What's the earliest surviving manuscript of the New Testament? And that's going to be a document called P52. Again, do a Google search on that. P52 is a fragment of the Gospel of John. We believe the Gospel of John was written around 90 AD, and P52 has been dated to about 125 AD. So from 90 to 125, what is that, like 30 years? The earliest surviving Greek manuscript we have, or portion of a manuscript, is 30 years after the original. Again, there's something transcendent about that, because if you look at the distance of the earliest manuscripts of other writings of antiquities, again, I think the Iliad, I should have looked this up for you, but the earliest surviving manuscript, I want to say, is 800 years after the Iliad was written. So a distance of 800 years is one of the best attested manuscripts written by men, and yet we have biblical manuscripts that are as early as 30 years after the original. That's the kind of stuff that I'm saying, wow, that's mind-boggling. It's really fascinating to fill out and look at the questions on a piece of paper and to write in all those numbers and to see what that looks like. And then sit back for a moment and just take it in. Doesn't that look divine? Like there is something transcendent. This is not something made by the creature. This book is something that was designed by the Creator. Okay, so up to that point, the conversation was very amicable, very interesting. The Mormons told me that they weren't allowed to use their smartphone. They said that while they're on mission, they're not allowed to use the internet. They're not allowed to watch TV. They're not allowed to look things up on their smartphone internet. They're able to look up the Book of Mormon on their Bible. So they weren't allowed to use their smartphone. I used it for them, and we filled this out together. And I'm telling you, it was very pleasant. There was no headbutting. We both really enjoyed the study. So now came the point where I turn it over to them and I go, okay, same questions. I'd like, since you're familiar with the Book of Mormon, I'd like to hear you talk to me about why you believe the Book of Mormon is transcendent, divine, come down to us out of heaven. So we do the same questions. And the first one was, who wrote the Book of Mormon? How many authors were there? And they were interested in that. They had never questioned that. So they looked up the Book of Mormon, and I guess they must have just counted the number of books, how many prophets, how many books, and they just took a guess. They said it looked like 12. They either said 12 or 15 people. But they didn't know for sure. So fair enough, we put 12 or 15 there. And how long did it take to write the Book of Mormon? And they didn't have an answer. They weren't sure. They thought that the writings began. One thing they did say was that the original authors who wrote down the manuscripts of the Book of Mormon were in America when they were written. And I looked it up. They weren't allowed to look it up, but I looked it up, and it looked like the internet answer to how long did it take to write the Book of Mormon. It said that the Book of Mormon was written between 600 BC, 600 years before Christ, back around the Babylonian exile, all the way through to 420 AD, 420 years after Christ. So that would put the total time to write all of it at about 1,000 years. Now, I'd put a little question mark by that because the concern here is that the Old Testament predicted that there would be a time of silence where the people would not hear from God. And that time of silence was after Malachi, 400 years before Christ, all the way up to the time of Christ, was a 400 years of silence. Nobody hears from God during that time, and that was a prophecy. So we kind of discussed that and didn't really know what to do with that. But they have 600 years before Christ to 400 years after Christ. The other thing I brought up is in the New Testament, the last New Testament book written was around 90 AD. And the Bible itself says that the gospel was delivered once and for all. Jude writes to the church and he said, I felt the necessity to write to you, appealing that you contend earnestly for the faith which was once and for all delivered to the saints. That concept in the past, once and for all delivered to the saints, Jude is saying that's already happened. So I would want to give that some thought. If Jude is saying that by the first century, the gospel had been once and for all delivered to the saints, you'd really have to question how is it then that Joseph Smith delivered an addition to the gospel in the 1800s. Jude said that in that first century, it had already been delivered once and for all. So little red flag for me there. And we didn't know what to do with that. So if we continue on, the next question we looked at, what was the language that the Book of Mormon was written in? What language between that 600 BC to that 400 AD in the Americas, what language were they writing in? And they didn't know. And so we looked it up, and it's something called Reformed Egyptian. Reformed Egyptian. Does seem a little bit strange again that in America that they would be writing in Egyptian, although I don't know what language they would be writing in. So a little bit of a question there, but this Reformed Egyptian. So we did a quick little Google search of Reformed Egyptian, and all of the Google searches said that there is no language called Reformed Egyptian, and there are no manuscripts whatsoever about anything that are written in Reformed Egyptian. So again, another red flag. Modern day linguists say that there's no such thing as Reformed Egyptian. So just a red flag. I'm not sure what to do with that. So we go on. What language? Reformed Egyptian. How many surviving manuscripts are there in that original language, the Reformed Egyptian? Because, when they write something over 1,000-year period of time, people are going to make a lot of copies of that. And so how many copies do we have? And they said we don't have any. So there's 0. And so we go on, well, how many copies do we have in other languages? Did the Indians make copies? Were there any copies in Latin or Greek or Hebrew or English? I don't know what language was being spoke, but what other languages do we have copies of those manuscripts? And the answer was 0. There are no manuscripts that you can go back and verify the translation of the Book of Mormon. Quite a huge contrast with the New Testament. There are over 20,000 surviving manuscripts that we can use to double check our English translations to make sure that our English translations exactly translated what those surviving manuscripts said. But with the Book of Mormon, there are no surviving manuscripts whatsoever. They said that they were written on golden plates that were taken up to heaven after Joseph Smith. So nobody ever made copies. Nobody ever it's hard to accept that when I'm so used to the abundant number of Greek manuscripts that I use on a regular basis writing sermons. We've got all of them that we can look at to know for sure that our translations are accurate, but you can't do that with the Book of Mormon. There's no way to make sure it's accurate because there are no original manuscripts. Another big flag. What was the earliest surviving manuscript of the Book of Mormon, so that we can see, how long after it was written do we actually have a copy? And again, there are no surviving manuscripts, so there are no dates. And so that was all we did. I allowed them to share that with me, and then at the end we looked at the results. And we just kind of were in silence, because when you compare the two books, there's just something really profound that hits home. I wanted to share that with you, and hope that's of some value to you.